Hi, I'm Susan Soberad.
And I'm Christine Cooney.
I'm a science teacher.
And I'm an English and social studies teacher. And we've been experimenting with blending science and humanities curriculum to make it more engaging and relevant for our students.
Today, we're going to be talking about the greatest lakes. There's 5 of them: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario.
So we're going to give you some background on the Great Lakes region and talk about some of the issues that are going on around the Great Lakes. I knew the Great Lakes, they were huge. I know that they were formed by glaciers, but I didn't realize how long ago these lakes formed. The last glacier receded 15,000 years ago.
You know, there was an awful lot of water left behind. 6 quadrillion gallons. That's 15 zeros, an almost unimaginable number. A number that is equal to 1/5 or 20% of the world's fresh water supply. 48 million people get their drinking water from the Great Lakes. 1.5 million people have jobs because of the Great Lakes. $60 billion in wages. And a $6 trillion regional economy. You know, if the Great Lakes region were a country, it would have one of the largest economies in the world.
I wanted to know a little bit about some of the species that were here. And I never realized there were 3,500 different species of plants and animals in this region. And now that I think about it, driving around the state, you have so much diversity. Driving around, you'll have different types of forests. You'll have marshes and wetlands and these giant dunes that, they look like small mountains. And then you also have the grasslands and the prairie. I come from a family that loves to fish, and they'll talk about all these different types of species, including salmon and bluegill and trout and whitefish and walleye and perch. And so definitely my family grew up on those Friday night fish fries. And of course, everyone knows about deer. You also have black bears. My grandma talks about seeing black bear every year in her backyard. You go far enough north, there's beavers. My family has a pack of coyotes that go through every summer. And then we even have in the Upper Peninsula, we have wolves, and we have a species of lynx.
And think about all those birds that fly around. Herring gulls and osprey, whooping cranes, snowy owls, wood ducks, great blue herons, and the fabulous bald eagle lives in this area. And piping plovers. In fact, I've noticed on some of the beaches around Lake Michigan that they actually have breeding grounds for the plovers that are marked off and you're not supposed to go in there, so we can help those plovers regain their populations.
Yeah, and even some of these species of birds, we might think of, it must be in really remote areas. My parents who, they live rural, but they don't live in northern Michigan. They see osprey and bald eagles right outside their house sometimes. And so it's just great to see such a diverse wildlife.
I guess the unfortunate part about all the wildlife that the Great Lakes can support is that it's also a nice home for invasive species. And unfortunately, these invasive species compete with all of these native species of fish and wildlife for food and habitats. There are 180 invasive species that have been introduced since the late 1800s. One of the most recent, this just sounds terrifying to me. It's the spiny water flea. This tiny little creature is competing with native fish for zooplankton, which is a microscopic organism that fish like to eat. Well, when the zooplankton goes away, then the native fish don't have anything to eat and they can't survive. So those tiny little water fleas are causing a problem.
So I've heard about invasive species. I remember in a high school biology class, and even in college I took some science classes, but I don't really know, how do they even get to our region? How do they even get into the Great Lakes?
Well, a lot of them, Christine, have come in through ballast water in boats. Ballast water is added to the bottom hull of the boat in order to keep it stable in the water. So, when a ship is full of cargo, it's not a problem. The ship sits low in the water, it's very stable, and it can go take its cargo wherever it needs to go. But when it offloads that cargo, then it starts riding higher and higher. It sits up higher in the water, and it gets very kind of tipsy. So they replace the weight of the cargo with water in the ballast tank, and that weight of the water makes the boat sink and it's stable again. But unfortunately, when they suck in that water into the ballast tank, they bring in with it invasive species. zebra mussels, quagga mussels, little fish eggs, all kinds of things. When they get to where they're going to pick up their cargo and they start adding cargo, well, they don't want the ship to sink, so they release the ballast water. So they have just carried these invasive species all the way up from other places into the Great Lakes. Our Great Lakes, of course, are connected to the Atlantic Ocean, so there's ships moving up and down the rivers all the time, and so it's a real problem.
So they're basically stowaways.
Yeah, they're
different
basically
places.
stowaways. That's exactly right. Sneaky little things.
So something that I found really interesting is that the Great Lakes are sometimes referred to as inland seas, just because they're so large and they have so much water, but they're not salty. And so I had to research a little bit of how does a body of water become salty? And actually our Earth's seas were probably not that salty. They became salty because over time, as rain fell and ran over rocks, they transported minerals into the oceans, and it was a process for the oceans to become saltier. So that makes me wonder, why are our Great Lakes not salty? Because they're getting all of these rivers and streams fed into them. Why are the Great Lakes not salty like the oceans?
Well, and that's a great question, and I didn't know either. I had to look that up myself. So you mentioned in the beginning that the water in the Great Lakes came from glaciers when they melted. But what we have to remember is that the Great Lakes are also fed by rivers, which you just mentioned. In fact, much of the water found in the rivers and streams in Michigan flows into one of our 4 Great Lakes. Michigan actually touches 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. So why aren't they salty? Well, the Great Lakes are connected, as I mentioned, to the Atlantic Ocean, so they're constantly circulating water. So the Great Lakes not only have an inflow of water from surrounding lands or other lakes, they also have an outlet flow of water. So water flows from the northern and western lakes into the eastern and more southerly ones, and eventually it reaches the sea. Water continually turns over, so the water doesn't hang around in the Great Lakes long enough to become salty.
One of the big things today is thinking about what is the human impact on our Great Lakes. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is pollution. Many toxins were introduced to the Great Lakes and chemicals from industrial waste and runoff from cities, agricultural runoff as well. I mean, Michigan has a large agricultural industry. There's also many companies, especially on the east side of the state. And these are all things that can cause our ecosystem to go out of balance. And things like algae blooms and dead zones can develop from that.
You are absolutely right. And one of the other things I think that people don't often think about that really affects our Great Lakes is this idea of climate change. Our atmosphere is warming, and a warmer atmosphere holds more water, which leads to more precipitation, more storms. Storms bring higher waves, more shoreline erosion. Precipitation can cause flooding, increased runoff, and that runoff carries more pollution with it right back into the lakes again. And so because the Great Lakes have the potential to impact so many people that live in the region, this Great Lakes watershed is really critical to the health and well-being of so many organisms, and of course all the people who live along the shores of those lakes. The science is there, and it's up to us to take that science and make sure we use the evidence that we're aware of to protect and care for this region's most precious resource, the greatest lakes of all, our Great Lakes.